Welcome to this week's episode of Sojourner, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
Welcome back to the ongoing series, How Spaces Define Masculinity, a Black and Black-Biracial men's initiative. My name is Carol Jean Matthews-Shifflett, and I am the CEO of the Sojourner Group. I'd like to start by thanking my sponsors, the Utah Jazz, Planned Parenthood Association of Utah, Pacific Island Knowledge to Action Resource, PCAR, the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, UCASA, and Enlightened Productions. Today, we're going to speak to millennials. How exciting. We have, first, Elijah Garfield. He is the director of the Black Cultural Center at the University of Utah, and his foundation years were spent in Rochester, New York. And then we have Brian McLeod, an educator, father, son, brother, friend, and a CHMC clinical intern. His foundation was spent in Salt Lake City, Utah. And lastly, we have Akibi Archer, PhD and MBA. He is an engineer, entrepreneur, and educator in Beltsville, Maryland, and his foundation years were spent in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Welcome to each of you. So we're going to start today by asking you, although I gave a brief overview, I want you to give a 1 or 2 minute introduction of who you are, where you grew up, what adults were in your home while you were growing up, and if that question is uncomfortable for you, that's fine. And what adults most influenced your masculinity? Was it a family member, a mother, a father, actually, a grandfather, uncle, a cousin, a neighbor, or a community member? So I'll go ahead and start at the top here with Elijah.
Yes, thank you for asking the question. So as you stated, I'm originally from Rochester, New York, born and raised, and kind of grew up through, of course, being a millennial, the 90s and early 2000s. Kind of where I grew up has been, I grew up in not a two-parent household, but two households, I would say. My mother and my father were separated. I have a very different background, I would say. My mother was Catholic, and my father at the time was a minister in the Nation of Islam. So it was two distinct, different viewpoints, views, things of the nature, and how that kind of came into play. I also grew up during the time of, especially my teenage years, during stop and frisk, which was prominent in New York at the time, in which police officers can kind of stop you and ask you and question you just by walking down the street. I grew up as far as the men in my household. I had my father in my life, so that was actually great. It's just I didn't live with him all the time. I didn't end up living fully with my father until I was in high school. I lived with my mother from K to 8th grade, and then from 9th all the way until I left for college or for the military. I was with my father. And so I've had those different men in my life and kind of different stages throughout my life. I've always had kind of like a male mentor, I would say. But yeah.
So you were in the military as well?
Was in the military, yes. Was in the military, went to college. It paid for my undergrad, so that was great.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. You want to go ahead, Brian? You'll be next. Can you give us a response to that question?
Yeah, actually found a lot of parallels in Elijah's upbringing, but grew up here in Salt Lake City, West Jordan, to be exact. Parents biracial, father's Black, mom is white. When I was in the 9th grade, they split. And for the first year of that, I lived with my mom primarily, and then my dad got settled, and then in high school, I moved in with my pops. And, my dad was Southern Baptist, was a deacon in the church, didn't go as much. My mom was not religious at all. And I did have, my dad, he was around, so I'm grateful for that in terms of men in my life. But he had his friends My dad is very social, so I was around a lot of Black men. Just we go visit his family a lot, so I had uncles that I was around. But yeah, pretty much.
Where did you visit the family?
Southern California, Riverside.
Okay. All right. Akibi, you're next.
Yes. So, as mentioned, I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, mostly. I lived with my mother. My father he didn't live with us, but I knew him and he was around. He did spend a lot of time in Jamaica, where both of my parents are from.
Okay.
So we would go, to Jamaica for the summers, my brothers and I, spend time down there. So he was, definitely in a part of my life. And also I have pretty large families. My father is one of 11 and my mother is one of 12. So I had a lot of uncles around. A lot of my uncles are very good with their hands. So I kind of picked up on some things and that kind of helped me out in the engineering realm of what I studied. And also a lot of them were entrepreneurs, doing things on their own. So that kind of rubbed off on me as well. And yeah, so that's kind of where I got some of my ideas of masculinity from my father and, uncles and other men in the community.
Okay. So my next question, and we'll start with you, Akibi. What did it mean to be a man in your home environment and then in your community environment?
Yeah, so in my home, I grew up with my two brothers and my mother, mainly. We did have family that stayed with us every now and then, but it was mainly the three of us and my mother. And from a very early age, I was always, helping with things around the house. When I got my first job at 15, I started to just kind of step up and take care of things for myself. I started, made sure that my mom didn't have to basically spend any more money on me, the way I wanted to do it. I paid for my clothes, my school lunch, my gas for my car and insurance and everything. So that kind of prepared me early on. And some of those things aren't necessarily specific to masculinity. It's just kind of being an adult, I would say. But definitely those things helped me be prepared for when I went to college. So in my home, I'm the middle child, so I do have an older brother who's about 4 years older than me, and he kind of did the same things when he started working. I think he started working at 15 as well. So I kind of had that guidance to look at. And in the community where we grew up, I'd say about half. When I was 10, we moved to where my mother currently still lives. Before that, the community was a little rough where I was living, and I think my mom wanted us out of there as soon as possible. I used to get in trouble at school and in the neighborhood a little bit, so we moved to this new area, and I saw different ideas and different visions of Black men. I saw a lot more two-parent households. Two of my best friends growing up, they grew up with both of their parents in the home. And I still can see them and look to them. When I go back home and I visit them, and they kind of were able to give me that image of what a healthy Black man and women relationship could look like.
Okay. Thank you very much. Brian, what about you? I can repeat the question. What did it mean to be a man in your home environment? And what did it mean to be a man in your community environment?
In my home environment, my dad, like I said, he was always around. So, I had a model man in my life. And I think one thing that sat sticks with me in hindsight, looking back as being a young man, is I was kind of always a curious, gentle kid. But if any of that emerged, it was shut down, in large part just by my father, but then by the system that exists within masculinity in this country. So trying to figure out, part of being a gentleman is being a gentleman, and that's been evolving for me, and I'm getting more comfortable with that as I, in my mid 30s now. There was I think figures of like who displayed like emotions in a healthy way, but still were comfortable being a man. I think of, I didn't have my first Black teacher until I was in college. So that stands out to me. The University of Utah,
Wow.
Dr. Land is one.
Okay.
I think some of my peers too, who moved here, from out of state, were young Black men, were models for me as well. That were, still subscribe often to that idea of what masculinity is, or unhealthy masculinity. But as we've remained friends over the years, and just seeing us evolve as we become fathers and different roles in our life, and how, it's okay, to be a gentleman.
Yeah, I like that. Gentleman, gentleman. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead over to Elijah.
Yes. So kind of on that question on what created that foundation. My father and my mother both had their views of what a man should be. And I've had to kind of mix and blend the two of them. My father was very much so like, Elijah, you are a genius. Go out there, spread your seed, or as he say, which I wasn't really about that, but just go out there and be this man. But I also agreed with him in some aspects of, he always told me to be a pillar to the community, and rather you move to any community and you inhabit any community, making sure that you connect with that community, and that you bring people together. He was a very much, the lessons in which I've learned from him was to be a bridge, in which I don't see a lot of people kind of say that anymore, but just like be a bridge or a connector between your world and those who want to get to that world. And he was always just pushing me to like, always be a bridge in everything that you do. If you gain new knowledge, make sure you breed a bridge and connect that new knowledge to those that don't have that knowledge. Very told me, as far as in being masculine, was to be 2 steps ahead of the game, making sure that you understood and you learned about systems. I got my famous saying that I've always shared with him since elementary school. He told me since the jump, he says, in order to change a system, you must understand it first. So with that, I've always kind of been, that saying has always been instilled. It's my philosophy of everything. Like, in order to change something, you must understand it first. And so he was always saying, okay, breed that bridge, but also think 2 steps ahead, have knowledge of things, learn, read up on things, know what is happening in the world around you. Because if you don't, you're just going to be blind. And then my mother on the other side was like, oh, your father's going to tell you these things, but what you need to do on top of that is also have emotion. Be in touch with your emotions, because not a lot of men are in touch with their emotions. Make sure that you can communicate those emotions to people, but also on top of that, don't hold stuff in. Talk to people, express those things, but also making sure that you become emotionally intelligent over time. Because you said that is one of the greatest weapons a man can have, is being in tune with their emotions, because not everyone can. And being calm, cool, collective, and understanding, okay, well, let me just keep this into my head. And then lastly, kind of what Ryan was kind of stating, the blending of the two was getting like, okay, how do you be, one, a classic man, as the Jadena song, be a classic man, but also a gentleman, making sure that you take those old uphold those old standards is opening doors for people, making sure that you treat your elders right.
Okay.
But you do just all those different types of things. But yeah.
Okay. I like that. Now, what about in the community? I mean, I think Akibi spoke to it a little bit, but what about in the community? What did it mean to be a man when you stepped outside of your house?
Yes.
Anybody wants to talk about this, you can. But when you stepped outside of your home and you were with your buddies, or like Akibi was saying, you know, he got into a little bit of trouble. I don't know if that was with your friends from high school, your buddies, or what. Can you go ahead and follow up with that? What did that mean? Go ahead and we'll go ahead. Okay, Akibi, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just this was earlier on, probably like in elementary school, and so it was a little bit before um, I would say manhood, but it kind of did center around masculinity. The neighborhood that I uh, was living in before, fighting was okay. You know, we were just boys. We would, if we were playing basketball and or football, and you got hit too hard, you'd want to fight the other boy, and then it was the next day you were back to playing basketball together. It wasn't,
Okay.
you know, anything too serious, but that didn't translate well to when I went to school. Right, so that at school they saw fighting in a very different light, and I was in a different program, so the school I went to was majority white, but the neighborhood I grew up in was majority black.
Okay.
So that was a whole different dynamic that I had to learn how to navigate. You know, I can't do the same things at school and I did in the community at home.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else want to pick up on that one? Who wants to pick up? Just go for it, guys. Just
Yeah,
talk.
I would say agreeing in that aspect as far as in boys, we just fought. Like if you wanted to handle something, it's like, okay, meet me outside. We're gonna handle this. We're gonna fight about it. We're gonna wrestle and tassel about things. And that was like the definition. Like you fought with your hands, but also your words. That
Mhm.
was like the biggest concept that I've kind of learned in my community was just like, okay, you not only have to learn how to have hands, but can you say something as well? Rather than be grilling on somebody, talking down or talking back, or can you talk about somebody and make them feel pain, getting at somebody's core, not only with your fist, but also your words.
Kind of like
Um,
the
that's how
dozens and your mama and all of that. Was that what it was?
yeah.
What about you, Brian?
For me, I think it was attributed to a lot of sports. That's where I identified a lot of my manhood. Um, less less on the fighting, but there is the documentary, "The Mask You Live In." One of the opening,
Yes. Hmm.
statements that somebody says, if you want to start a fight in this country, go to a playground and ask the young men who's the weakest one here, and they'll get to fighting real quick. Um,
Mm.
and I definitely remember those moments. Like I said, I was, a gentle kid, and things would upset me and I would cry, but then I was shamed for it, right? Or I was picked on, and I was like, I'm not gonna let that happen anymore. So I would like shut that shit down, and then I would put on the football pads, pick up the basketball. So I fought through sports often.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now, since we brought that up and you all are talking about fighting with your hands and with your words, what's your opinion on today? This came up in one of the first conference with fighting with weapons. Does anybody have an opinion on that when it comes to showing your manhood through guns and so on? because that came up in the first one. We had seniors on, and they said, I just don't understand this fighting with weapons and with guns and killing. And one of the things that they said was, we grew up in a neighborhood of Black people. We grew up where everybody knew each other, and so that kind of stuff wasn't like it is today. So who wants to address that first?
Oh, you want to go ahead?
Oh, you can go ahead.
No, I think, especially growing up in Rochester, where it's like, I think at the time it was like 40% Black. We did have a Black community, but I don't know if you all know, Rochester is actually one of the most dangerous cities in America, as far as in gun violence in comparison to other kind of mid-sized cities in the country. They're like on the level.
That.
They're on the level like St. Louis and various other places where the deaths a year is in the hundreds. Sometimes it can even reach 1,000. And so the summer is usually called Blood Summer, where people, during the summertime, it gets heated. People are fighting, rather it be on just various topics, rather it be over a woman, drugs, loss of job, or just things going on. You just standing on the wrong corner. And I think as far as not guns, they're just so accessible. That was me growing up in our community. Guns were just so accessible. And you can grab a gun from pretty much anywhere. And so with that, gun culture was just, even though New York has some of the strictest laws on guns, it was just so easy still in some instances to get a gun back home. And so I think as time progressed, when I was a little kid, yes, it was words in your fists. But as I got older, they were like, nah, forget the words or forget the fists. Let me pull out the Glock.
As you got older,
End your life. I don't care. People got ruthless. I don't know what it was, and it was like around like middle school for me. But people were just like, no, I don't care about the hands anymore. We young, but I'll pull something fast on you. Let me pop the trunk on you real quick. And it's just like, oh.
so that's that masculinity that I'm asking about. Were those weapons, instead of the words and the fists now, we're going to the weapons. And in your mind, was that some sort of sense of masculinity?
I think it was very much ingrained with masculinity, as far as in you've seen the majority. And the crazy thing about that too is that the majority of the people that had guns were men in my community. Rather it be on the block, rather it be you're doing a storefront operation or just other things in general. Like the majority of people in our community were men with guns.
Adult, is that what you're saying? Older men?
No. So you could be as young as like 12 with the weapon.
Okay.
Yeah, everyone really. And then, I mean, of course, if you weren't really about that, you try not to be a part of that type of stuff, which I try not to be a part of. But you can be as young as 12. Done.
Okay. Akibi, you were going to speak to that. We'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, there's a saying that, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight. And I think that's where a lot of men may not want to be caught off guard. If nobody had guns, if I knew nobody had guns, then I wouldn't need a gun, So it's kind of that mentality. But I do think a part of it today, for me at least, is, just protection for my family. And if, early on, I could probably say I never really wanted a gun. But, after getting married and having 2 children, it's kind of like, well, I don't want, God forbid something happen in my home and, I'm unable to defend my family. It's even, so that I kind of see as a level of masculinity to be able to protect, your loved ones. And in unfortunately in America, that kind of means having a gun because they're just so accessible. You don't know who has a gun, who doesn't have a gun. So, yeah.
So growing up, you weren't like Malaysia, living in a community where having a gun became the norm.
No, definitely not. The schools that I went to that were majority Black, you may have heard about it, but it wasn't the norm, and definitely not in my community.
Was that in Florida? Or was that in
Yes.
Florida? Okay, it was in
Yeah,
Florida.
that was in Florida.
What about you, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, my pops had, due to the nature of his job, he had guns in the home. Um, in Naturally, as a young man, middle school, I was curious and asked if he would take me out to go shoot them, and he was always like, "No, don't ever touch it. Don't
Mm.
even look at it." Like not until even until like when I was an adult, I was like, "Hey, can we go shooting?" And he was like, "Nope." You always shut it down, which I think was fear on his own part. But I think oftentimes fear and love can get like conflated, and at this point in my life, I really have no desire to use um, I use weapons in other ways.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And I think you answered the next question. How did these spaces impact your understanding of masculinity? So when Elijah was speaking earlier, you went from your mouth to from your fist to a weapon because you had to prove, I guess you had to prove yourself in the community. Is that it? Did you feel like you had to prove something? If you didn't, what would happen? What would people say?
Yeah, I think for me, proving myself was often, like I said, through sports, right? Like it's that competitive spirit on there. Let's take it to the basketball court, or I'll see you on the field, um, which is another form, just like of violence or a weapon, as I spoke to. Um, but yeah, I didn't never came to that. There was very few times where it came to hands. It did, but I mean, maybe that was just the nature of my personality.
Okay. Anybody else want to speak to that? Because I'm gonna ask Brian a question, but go ahead. Malaysia or
Yeah,
Akiva, you want to jump to that?
I would say how did these spaces impact my masculinity in that aspect of if you didn't have a gun and if that wasn't your way of proving that you're a man, the only other ways was one, if you were the flyest looking brother in school with the freshest kicks, you had the clothes, you had the jewelry. If you can prove a man being that way, if not, if you were a nerd or whatnot and you didn't have the fleshless clothes, you proved that you're a man by fighting. And if you didn't prove that you were fighting, it was either you were kind of cast off, or you just kind of try to take you apart, take away from that. So if like for my instance, I was like a blurred, I was a black nerd, very into comics, things of the nature. So I kind of like was like, okay, I'm not really gonna be fighting like that. I'm also not gonna be. I ain't have all the flyest clothes, the Sean
Okay.
John time and all that other stuff. And so during that time, I just was like, I kind of cast myself off. I made other friends, and we were kind of like the outcast group, I would say.
Okay. All right. So you did find some place to fit in. It's just that you didn't fit into the whatever crowd you want to call that. What about you, Akibi?
Yeah, for me, it was kind of similar to what Brian was saying. With sports was a big thing. I played a few sports up until high school. And then also the clothing and even a car. So having a car was a big deal.
Mm.
Being able to, go where you wanted to go and and just having that freedom kind of was a way to prove masculinity. And also working and having money to buy things you wanted. And so those are kind of some of the things for me that kind of influence what you thought of as a man growing up.
What age did you have to have that car?
Um, high school. So
Mm.
definitely, junior and senior year. um, and that was one thing I was grateful for. My father actually gave me my first car. It was the car was as old as I was, but it was it was a car, and I worked to keep it up and pay insurance and put gas in it. But that kind of gave me some freedom and kind of help kind of shape that idea of masculinity in high school.
So you didn't have to have a newer car. It didn't matter how old the car was. You just had to have a car.
Yeah, correct.
Masculinity. What about the other two? What about you two? Did you have to have a car to show your masculinity in town?
No, I did not have to have a car. I actually didn't get my license until I was like 19, uh, mainly because in Rochester, the public transportation was actually really good. So we didn't really have to have a car. It wasn't required per se. But yeah.
Oh, okay. What about you, Brian?
I don't know that I had to have one, but I had one. I had my first car was a 1983 Buick Regal. My pops was really into older cars, and I think just he kind of got some satisfaction in seeing me drive it. And it was a popular car amongst my peers. It was you can imagine it's like everybody was like, "Is that a Cutlass?" But it wasn't, and it was long, and it had teacher license plates on it, but it was TEECHER, so it had a nickname known as the teacher. And then, that was just spoke into existence because I became a teacher. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to share real quick. I mean, listening to you all talk about this car thing, I had two teenagers, and I had a Beetle, a little beat up yellow Beetle, and I always had a gay pride sticker on the back of it just to show my support. And my boys used to always pull that sticker off the car. I'm like, why are you pulling this sticker off the car? So I think it's interesting to hear you talk about you got to have a car. You got to have a car.
Stay tuned for the next episode on How Spaces Define Masculinity, a Black and Black-Biracial Men's Initiative.